Hello, can you hear me? Is anyone there? Hello. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Nietzsche, and what I'm aiming for is, I've said most of the stuff that I wanted to say about the genealogy. So I've kind of worked through a lot of what I find most interesting in the genealogy. I do want to talk about 113, carry on what I was talking about last time about beauty. And then next week, I guess we could spend Monday, we could talk a bit about Nietzsche. I'm thinking that next week we'll start moving on. I'm looking for the chalk. Oh yeah, I'll start moving on to Russell and Wittgenstein. So it's a complete change of track. It's still sort of German, but it's a very different type of German. Wittgenstein was also very influenced by Schopenhauer. So I think there's that sort of connection. And then in terms of grading, I said there were going to be two midterms, and the first midterm is going to be, sorry, not two midterms, two take-homes. The first one is going to be Hegel, Mill, and Nietzsche. And in the past, I've done these midterms where I've sort of given you a bunch of questions and asked you to give short questions, short answers, like a half a page. I'm thinking with the material we're looking at, it might be better to give slightly less questions and to have slightly longer answers. So what I'm thinking about is giving you a sort of take home where maybe you have to answer 4 questions with at least one on each of the authors. And the answers should be like roughly a page, something like that. So rather than having 6 very short answers, giving you a little bit more time, I think some of these texts you might want to say a little bit more about. So that's sort of my, does that sound reasonable? Yeah, so it means you'll have to say something about Hegel, something about Mill, something about Nietzsche, and then maybe one more, so like 4 questions altogether. Sound cool? No? Scary? Oh, I'm scared. Yeah, I'll send you some questions. And what I'm thinking is that I've got my papers for the other class coming in before the Bayram. And so I guess I'm not going to have time to grade from this class before the Bayram. So I'm thinking of having a deadline like after the Bayram. Does that sound cool? Yeah. And then you'll have a final that would be just on Wittgenstein and Russell, a final take home. And because it's a bit unevenly spread out, because Nietzsche's sort of in the middle, it's a bit difficult to organize it. I could have either just done at the beginning, just had a take home on Hegel and Mill, but that wasn't enough. So the semester, the grading is a bit not spread out in the right way. So I guess the midterm might have a little bit more, there might be more questions, and so the midterm might be worth a little bit more than the final. When I've worked out the questions. So I'll send you the questions in the coming week. Yeah. And it shouldn't be too difficult. So I'm thinking next week that I'm going to try and talk about the things I want to talk about in Nietzsche. For class on Tuesday, I'd really like it. I've got a couple of things I could talk about in Nietzsche, but I'd really like it if students came up and kind of came up with suggestions for sections of the genealogy that they thought were particularly interesting. So on class on Tuesday, I'm going to ask you guys for suggestions, and then I'm going to be really silent for a bit, and it's going to be really awkward and embarrassing. And then either you're all going to turn your cameras off, and then I'm just going to be stuck there in darkness and kind of in this sort of void of Istanbul nihilism, or someone's going to say, Hodja, what about kind of section 2, number 20? I thought that was really cool. Yeah, so class on Tuesday, try and I'll ask you to give your suggestions of things that you thought were interesting, things you didn't understand, things that you found really offensive. Like, I'm surprised none of you are more offended by Nietzsche. Like, kind of, he's anti-democratic. he's against mass culture. He's very sexist. He's against feminism, or he seems to be. Yeah, so I'm wondering what you make of this stuff. Does this, to what degree does this undermine Nietzsche as a philosopher? Okay, so today I want to talk about a couple of passages. I'm going to start. I keep saying I'm going to talk about 113, and this is one of the most influential bits of Nietzsche. One of the things I think about Nietzsche is that, like, as a whole, maybe he was a sort of reactionary sexist there, yeah. But I think there's some really cool things in Nietzsche that he's sort of very much independent of that. So I think like passages like 113 can be very much read out of context. I think one of the things about Nietzsche is that even if as a whole you're not sure what to make of it, or you may not be open to some of it, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff. So 113, this is in section 1. What's the main context of this passage? What's he been talking about? So he's been talking about the slave revolt in morality. Yeah, this reevaluation of values. Yeah. Remember, according to the noble valuation, you have good, and good means me. It means noble, high-born, rich, strong. And bad, this means, you guys, dirty, smelly, poor, weak, low-born. I remember Nietzsche was trained as a philologist, so he's not just making this up. So this is why I'm not a big fan of these sort of French postmodern interpretations. But he thinks he's offering evidence. He's got a theory about the history, and he's offering the evidence he's offering is linguistic. He says, look at all these various languages, that the original words in Homer, in Old German, the tribal times, the words for good, all meaning noble, high-born, rich. And the words for bad means sort of poor, unlucky, unfortunate. Yeah, So you have this valuation system that is sort of self-affirming. It's a noble form of evaluation. With the slave revolt, you've got these people who are too weak to take revenge, too weak to have power. And so the idea is they take this imaginary revenge, by kind of cursing the nobles under their breath. Like you're a slave and you're just like, yeah, you say it in your head, you sort of take revenge in your head, and you're just like, these people call themselves great, but they're really shits, we're the good ones. So the slave revolt involves this inversion of this value system, where that you might think this is egoistic, self-affirming. Yeah, this sort of stuff is evil. Powerful domination. Yeah, so we have this morality that says what's good is not being dominated, not being overbearing, not being egoistical. Yeah, so what's good is being non-dominating, selfless. And Nietzsche takes this to be another. Now, part of this revaluation of values, Nietzsche thinks, involves the emergence of something like a self. He thinks that in for these nobles, for this noble type of morality, there's no there. These nobles have no character. They just act. They don't have any inner life. I mean, if you read epic poetry, it's a bit boring. Like today, what we want from a novel is we want to understand motivations in inner life. And all you get in epics are guys hitting each other. There's not very much inner life. There's not much self-consciousness. There's not much reflection. There's not much. There's sort of strength, but in some sense there's not much self. There's no soul. There's no I. And it's egoistical in one sense, but it's egoistical without a sort of self-conscious self-understanding. I think Nietzsche thinks that with the slaves that you get the emergence of something like self-consciousness. Now, I think one thing that would be interesting, I was thinking of doing is something that's a bit Hegelian. Yeah, the Hegel in his early work, when he was more romantic, you have the master-slave dialectic. So in the phenomenology of spirit, this phenomenology of spirit is how knowledge is possible. And the sort of idea is knowledge of a world, real knowledge requires self-knowledge, which requires knowledge of others, which requires mutual recognition, and you can only come to have knowledge and self-knowledge in a republic. This is sort of, but one of the things that Hegel stresses in this famous master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology is that it's sort of with the slaves that you get more of a sort of emergence of self-consciousness. Yeah, because the master just doesn't have to think. There's nothing to resist them. But the slave, in some sense, has to take the consciousness of the master and somehow interact with it. Yeah, and there's some other opposed to that offers some sort of other position that allows them to have something like a self-recognition. I think Nietzsche has got a similar view, that it's with the slaves that we get, with the slave morality, that we get the emergence of something like an inner life. Yeah, because these people can't act outwardly, because they can't express their sexual desires and their aggression, because they're not allowed to give expression to this in the world. Nietzsche's got this idea that it sort of builds up, and they turn this aggression inwards. Yeah, they turn their anger onto themselves. Yep.
And they like assume this kind of holding back is because of their conscience, and they take it as a virtue.
Yes, so this is 113. I'm building up to exactly what you said. That and part of this sort of becoming inwardness, part of this inwardness is the emergence of the idea of something like responsibility and freedom of the will. So he thinks that these people just express themselves. They do things from their nature. And I think they have an idea of ownership of stuff. You did something and you own it. But the idea of being responsible for it and being responsible because you're free, this isn't part of the old set of values. This is part of the sort of the reevaluation of values that we find in Christianity, in these sort of anti-noble values. So along with this sort of, with the emergence of something like inner life, and the idea is that because if you're allowed to do stuff, whatever you want, you don't really think about stuff very much. You just go out and do stuff. But if you can't do stuff, if you're constrained, you have to sort of imagine. Yeah, and so your action becomes imaginary action rather than actual action. This is, imagination is the sort of action of the powerless. Yeah, that you have to act in your head rather than acting externally, and you develop a sort of rich, clever inner life. You become a lot cleverer because you think through all the possibilities in your head before you actually act. Whereas the sort of noble morality is sort of reactive. Someone makes you angry, you hit them on the head, boom, and then you forget about it. If you're a slave, someone makes you angry, and what you do is you're too powerless to do anything. So you kind of think about how to get your revenge for like 20 years, and then finally at the end of 20 years, it's like, I got you. Remember? Yeah. Remember when you trod on my foot in yeah. Yeah. And let's talk about before Niçe. He said some great things about this slave revolt. It's not all negative. Becoming interesting, becoming beautiful, lots of things we admire, we only have because of this type of self-consciousness that we only have because of this. Yeah, so one thing he thinks is involved in this is the kind of emergence of the invention of the idea of the freedom of will. So let's have a look. This is number 113. So I'm going to, what time is it now? Okay, yeah. Why don't they have a clock in a room like this? It just seems, yeah, so I can't, because I'm recording the class, I can't see on my phone. So here he's kind of talking about a slave revolt, and we've got the kind of bird of prey. Often he talks about the nobles as these sort of blonde beasts. He's not talking about Huns so much. I think he's talking about lions. The blonde beast, not a German, but a lion. When you often when he talks about a bird of prey or a blonde beast, talking about these sort of wild hunting animals. These poor are the lambs. Anyone know anything about Christianity and lambs? Yeah, so kind of, Jesus, I mean, the shepherd analogy, being the Lamb of God, yeah, it's a sort of, yeah. So when I talk about lambs, Nietzsche's father was a pastor, not a cake, not spaghetti, but a sort of like an imam, a Christian imam, pastor. Yeah. And so Nietzsche was originally training or thinking of his mum was training to be a priest, to be a pastor. So he sort of had a Christian background. Yeah. So appealing to lambs, I think the kind of Christian stuff here is, yeah. So he says, let's return then to the problem of the other origin of the good as conceived by the man of Resentiment. This is the slave who isn't able to act, but is made angry, and in the anger isn't allowed to discharge itself. So I think the person of Resentiment is the person who's kind of got all of these reactive attitudes. So someone treats you badly, and it causes this sort of natural reactive attitude with a sort of tendency to strike back, but who isn't allowed to react. So Resentiment is a sort of, is what happens when we're not able to act on our instincts, when we're constrained. He says that lambs dislike great birds of prey. Does not seem strange. Only it gives no grounds for reproaching these birds of prey for bearing off the little lambs. And if the lambs say amongst themselves, oh, these birds of prey are evil, and whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, would not he be good? There is no reason to fault with this institution of an ideal. Yeah, so the lamb's ideal, we can't blame them for this, except perhaps that the birds of prey might view it a little ironically and say, we don't dislike them at all, these good little lambs. We even love them. Nothing is more tasty than a tender lamb. We don't hate, these lambs hate us, but we really love lambs. They taste so good. Yeah. Now, to demand that of strength, that it should not express itself as strength, that it should not be a desire to overcome, a desire to throw down, a desire to become master, a thirst for enemies and resistance and triumph, it's just as absurd to demand of weakness that it should express itself as strength. A quantum of force is equivalent to a quantum of drive, will, effect. I'm going to read most of this section because I think it's such a good section. Yeah, and I'll comment on it. Yeah, yep. It is nothing other than precisely this very driving, willing, affecting, and only owing to the seduction of language and of the fundamental errors of reason that are petrified in it, which conceives and misconceives all effects as conditioned by something that causes effects, by a subject, can it appear otherwise. So here we got this account of the seduction of language. I take it that another way of saying it is Nietzsche thinks we're sort of seduced by grammar. Yeah. And the invention, Nietzsche's got this idea that the notion of the subject, of subjectivity, is a sort of invention. This invention came about through this sort of system of valuation. Yeah. What there is really, yeah, it's processes. What's really fundamental are just processes. We might think of, I think Nietzsche is a sort of process philosopher rather than a substance philosopher. I think it's the big divide in the history of philosophy. I think all the philosophers going back to Plato, most of them kind of think that what's fundamental is substances. So you've got things and their properties, subjects and their actions. I think a process philosopher thinks what's more basic are these sort of processes. Yeah, it's a sort of, and processes, if we think about them grammatically, you know, running, hitting, willing. Yeah, willing is a process. Yeah, so we express them with sort of gerunds. I think the mainstream school in philosophy has been this sort of substance ontology. That we start off with substances, and Nietzsche, I think, this is part of Nietzsche's metaphysics. I think here, I think it's much more into these sort of processes and individuals and substances are things that emerge from these processes. I think in terms of the history of philosophy, yeah, the big opponent to process philosophy, to substance metaphysics, is Heraclitus. And where was Heraclitus from? Anyone know? Yeah, where? Do you don't know where Heraclitus is from? Oh, Ephesus. Okay. Although he wasn't from there, because you can't step in the same town twice. I don't know. But yeah. But yeah, when I was at Camp, we used to organize philosophy road trips with our students in the spring break. And so we'd drive around Anatolia going to different places. So, you know, we could go to Miletus, which is the birthplace of philosophy, where you have Thales and, yeah, we'd have a sort of Heraclitus symposium in Ephesus. You can go to any other places with philosophers. Aphrodisias was the main center of Aristotelianism in the Hellenistic period. So you have Alexandria of Aphrodisias, but it was like one of the most important universities in the world. I think Alexandria and Aphrodisias were really the two of the biggest centers of learning. They got sort of purged with the emergence of Christianity. Yeah, there's lots of. Do you have Assos? Do people know about Assos? So, yeah, so in Assos, that's where Aristotle came after he got left Athens, and that's where he did most of his biology research. So it's the sort of birthplace of biology, and he married the daughter of the king of Assos. Yeah, so And every year there's one of my friends organizing a conference there in the summer and in the winter. In the winter it's in Turkish, in the summer it's in English. And this summer, he just emailed me, it's going to be unlocked this summer and it's going to be the first week of July. So those of you, and it's, has anyone been to the ASOS conference? Philosophy in ASOS? Oh, anyone heard of it? Okay, have a look. Philosophy. I mean, for the last few years, during COVID times, it's been a bit of a problem. And actually in ASOS itself, they had rock falls and the car has been closed. But it looks like this is the first time since COVID that it's going in its usual time in July. And it's quite fun. It's going to be a lot. And normally before COVID, there'd be lots of biology students there. So there's a bunch of different places people stay, but there's a beach called Kadiga Beach, and there's lots of kind of campsites there that are quite cheap. So students go camping, and then there's a bus, a mini bus that takes you to the events. Yeah, they did it, the last one, I gave a paper actually, it was on Wittgenstein. But in the past, they'd have the top scholars in the world on a particular subject. They have really, really good people. If you look through the past, yeah, it's one of the best things on the philosophy calendar in Turkey. And also ASOS. Anyone been to ASOS? Yeah, it's good, yeah? And imagine, and all the talks are outside. So it's yeah, one time, the first one I went to, there was this conference on ancient skepticism. And the ancient skeptics have this idea that you should suspend judgment about everything, and you should reach this sort of ataxia where you have this sort of peace. And so this whole conference was on ancient skepticism, and they had people, very famous people like Gisela Stryker, and Julia and Anas, all of the big ancient scholars. And there was this one Greek guy who every talk, at the end of the talk, he'd stand up and he said, "This reminds me of a paper I wrote 20 years ago." And then he'd pull the paper out of his pocket and start reading from it. And then during the last talk, he stands up in the middle of the talk and says, "Excuse me, I have something to say." And everyone's really embarrassed. They think he's going to start reading his paper in the middle of someone else's talk. He's like, "It seems that our hotel is on fire." And we looked out the window and the whole town is sort of burning down. And everyone comes running out and starts a chain. And we thought it was quite funny because they're supposed to be skeptics and they're supposed to withhold judgment. As soon as they saw the fire, they were just like, whoosh, yeah, putting it out. Yeah, so Nietzsche's coming from this background in, I think it's, well, what they really are sort of processes. Yeah, but because of our language, then with language, whenever you have a property, you need a thing that has it. Yeah. Whenever you have a process, you need some actor, you need some agent, you need something that's doing it. Yeah. So he thinks that we're sort of seduced by language, seduced by grammar. Yeah. In English, whenever you have an activity, you need an agent. Yeah. And Nietzsche thinks that this is a sort of double edge. So he says, we're seduced by language, which conceives and misconceives all effects as conditioned by something that causes effects, by a subject that can it appear otherwise. So once you introduce the idea of a subject of the action, then in some sense you can imagine the subject without the action. And so I think he thinks that it's with the idea of the subject behind the action that we get the idea of the possibility of freedom, because we're able to kind of separate the activity from the actor. Yeah. But just as the popular mind separates the lightning from its flash, in English we say the lightning flashes, say something similar in, how do you say, shimshakiur? Is that how you say it? What? Shimshakiur. Yeah, so you've got the shimshak, you've got the lightning and the flash. Yeah, I mean, all these languages do it, but there's not two things. Well, the lightning just is the flash. In the case of lightning, it's quite clear that we sort of doubled it. Yeah. In English, we say it's raining. That's weird, isn't it? What's raining? The rain is raining. You know, yeah, es regnet in German. What's similar? It's raining. But like, it's funny. What's raining? Do you ever ask yourself that? How do you say it's raining in Turkish? Yeah, rain is raining. Yeah. But when we say it's raining, which is worse, because you could say the rain is falling. It's like, yeah. But saying it's raining, that's weird. Yeah. What is the it that's doing the raining? Being? God? I don't know. Like, it, nature. If you're a spinicist, it is going to be, yeah. But just as the popular mind separates the lightning from its flash and takes the lacquer, the flash, for an action, for the operation of a subject called lightning, so popular morality also separates strength from expressions of strength, as if there were a neutral substratum behind the strong man, which was free to express strength or not to do so. But there is no such substratum. There is no being behind doing. No being behind doing. So I think that Nietzsche is sort of attracted in general to a sort of process metaphysics. So one thing you might say is that there is no being behind becoming. Okay. Remember last time we were talking about this sort of Platonism that posits something behind life, something more real, something ideal. Yeah, the realm of the forms. Plato, remember, makes a distinction between the forms and the realm of appearances. And the realm of appearances is the world of becoming. Everything in everything that we see, touch, and we know through the senses is in flux, changes. Everything that we see through the senses is given to us through the senses is the world of becoming. And Plato thinks, well, behind the world of becoming, we have the forms. And the forms are, well, the forms are. He says, very quite mysteriously, he says that the appearances both are and are not, whereas the forms are. This is Plato. And I think what he means by that is that, because things exist in time and they change, anything that exists in time and in space is, think of beauty. So the form of the beautiful is beautiful. Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. Whereas a beautiful person is going to be, beautiful from the front, but not from behind. Yeah. They might be beautiful for a man, but not beautiful for a horse. Yeah, like what a horse finds beautiful is going to be different from what, they might be beautiful today, but not beautiful in 100 years, because they're just going to be dead, or unless you're some weird, things decay and die and decompose. So everything in the realm of becoming both is and is not. So, for example, beautiful. So a beautiful boy, this is, Plato's, it's always a beautiful boy. Yeah, they're going to grow up. Yeah, so a beautiful boy is beautiful in some ways, but beauty itself, pure beauty is beautiful, absolutely. So we have the idea of the realm of being behind the realm of becoming. And I think this attack on this kind of there's no being behind doing, I think one of the things is at the end of the genealogy is we get this attack on the idea of transcendence, the idea of transcendent values, that what we should affirm is something beyond life, beyond the realm of becoming. Yeah, so in some sense, what we should value are things like the forms. And I think Nietzsche kind of wants to say, well, no, we need to learn, we need an ethics, a system of values that values the realm of becoming, of life, of growth. I think this is the sort of value system he wants to affirm, a kind of life-affirming set of values. But life is a process. Life is a process of particular type of process. There's a nice book actually that in my cog sci class an essay called Everything Flows, which is basically about process in biology, how biological systems, living systems are best thought of as processes, not as substances. This is by John McRae, the editor. If my other class read, there's a paper in there by Nicholson. I think that's my paper where he talks about how living things are basically best understood in thermodynamic terms, in terms of far from thermodynamic equilibrium, self-maintaining systems. They're sort of, and what's central to life is metabolism. Metabolism is a process. Yeah, so if I think Niçe, it's one of the first major philosophers writing after Darwin, and I think he's got this philosophy of sort of life affirmation, which involves affirming things that flow, affirming becoming. That everything alive, though, Nietzsche thinks, sort of is self-transcending. Yeah, everything alive is always overcoming itself. It's always changing into something new. It's sort of preserving itself, but sort of growing and decaying and changing. Yeah, so rather than seeking transcendence in this world outside of becoming, the sort of idea is to seek transcendence within the living, within the realm of becoming. I think this is in his unpublished final thing. A lot of the stuff is about the world. It's the world to power. You have this idea of the overman, but the overman is just the idea that life is always a process, that it's always changing, and that our life now is always in sort of transition. And what we should value are these sort of transitions. There's no being behind doing affecting becoming. Yeah, there's no being behind doing affecting becomer. The doer, being, is merely a fiction added to the deed. Being is only a fiction added to the action, the activity of becoming. This is the idea. The popular mind, in fact, doubles the deed when it sees the lightning flash. It is the deed of a deed. So, it posits the same event first as cause, then a second time as an effect. Scientists do know better when they say force moves or force causes and the like. All its coolness, its freedom from emotion notwithstanding, our entire science still lies under the misleading influence of language. This sort of misleading influence of language that always requires a bearer of properties, a subject of activity, and the like. If anyone's taking my PhD student, former PhD student Uz, he does this class on mind dynamics, and he's all kind of, a lot of that is based on a sort of process metaphysics, basic kind of understanding. I think if you look at, he has a physics background, and so physics, field theory, that particles aren't basic. What's basic are these sort of fields, and then particles, sort of individuals, particulars, stabilities emerge within the flux. And science is not disposed of that little changeling, the subject. The atom, for example, is such a changeling, as is the Kantian thing in itself. No wonder if the submerged, darkly glowering emotions of vengefulness and hatred exploit this belief for their own ends, and in fact, maintain no belief more ardently in the belief that the strong man is free to be weak and the bird of prey to be allowed. Yeah, but thus they gain the right to make the bird of prey accountable, being a bird of prey. And I think Nietzsche says that this idea, so Nietzsche sort of, he's got all this stuff about embracing all values, but there are certain things that Nietzsche clearly doesn't like and wants to change about his culture. I think there's a sort of set of things. I think this kind of punishment, blame, guilt, accountability, responsibility, holding people responsibility. So I think he thinks that these are sort of, these aspects of our moral system are sort of harmful. Rather than looking at the criminal as guilty, Niçe suggests, remember we looked at this 2 weeks ago, that we should look at them as sort of just diseased, as a sort of parasite that maybe needs to be kind of kept away, that society may need to protect itself. But the stronger you are, the less you need this sort of conceptual system. That he, I suggested when I talked about this before, that in this respect, I think the left, the progressives in the 60s and 70s and 80s tended to have a view like this, that against sort of punishment, and things like decriminalization, not holding. I think there's been a sort of move away from that amongst sort of at least American progressives, where there's much more of a sort of holding people. Let's hold people responsible for everything they do wrong. I think Niçe would sort of hate this. I think this understanding of the idea of freedom of will, is quite central to the sort of ethics he wants to get away with. Elsewhere, he introduces this idea of amor fati, the love of farts. No, love of fate. Is that how you spell it? Yeah. That in some sense he thinks that saying yes to life involves, in some sense, regarding things as if they couldn't have been otherwise. So Niçe introduces this idea of eternal recurrence. Have you heard about Nietzsche's eternal recurrence?
Yes.
Yeah. What's the story? Can you remember the details or?
I think it was about the ones because when we come back, into London, this is why we can never learn anything useful for break cycles or maybe repeat cycles over and over.
Well, I mean, there you've got the kind of, this is the kind of cycle of ixion that you can't get out of the wheel of life. I think Nietzsche's got a different idea though, because he introduces this idea a number of places as a way of thinking about what is it to say yes to life? What is it to kind of really affirm one's own existence? And he says, imagine the following. Imagine that you were told that being just repeats itself. Yeah, so this life you're living now is just going to be repeated over and over and over again. And so the world, there's only a finite number of possibilities, and the world just repeats itself. So you imagine you just live your life over and over again. Would you say yes to it? And Nietzsche's idea is that to love life, to be really self-affirming, is to answer yes to that question. Yeah? Whereas the temptation is always to say, well, if I lived my life again, I wouldn't have dated that girl in kind of high school, or that guy was a mistake. So I'd lived the life a little bit, and Nietzsche thinks that yet to really affirm life involves just saying yes. And so I think Nietzsche's often thought of as a sort of existentialist or a proto-existentialist. I think the one place where he really breaks with the sort of existentialist tradition is that he rejects, in some sense, he thinks the idea of subjectivity is a myth. Now, one thing about Nietzsche is myths can be good. Yeah, so he's not against myth. To say something's a myth isn't necessarily to reject it, because we need myths to live by. I think if you live by a certain myth, then it takes on a certain reality. Yeah, but you can make sort of things real. I think he thinks that he really does buy into a sort of certain type of determinism. Yeah, and he thinks that, I think he's a sort of, in some sense, a determinist and a non-compatibilist. He thinks that determinism isn't compatible with free will and responsibility. Yeah. And so I think he thinks all of these things. Yeah, the kind of modern understanding of punishment, where someone's punished for their crimes and someone's a criminal if they're responsible, so tying punishment to responsibility. I think he thinks that first of all, they're false. Yeah, they're based on a picture of the world that just isn't true. Yeah. And so they're false and bad. Yeah, so being false isn't really enough, because they might be myths that give life meaning, that make life livable, that improve things. But they're false and they're also harmful. So one of the things I like, I mean, I'm not sure I necessarily buy into the falseness side. I do like sort of attack on ideas of punishment and responsibility and the like. What time is it now? Oh, we have 3 minutes. Yeah, so if you're weak, you don't do anything, then believing in a free subject allows you to sort of, once again, it goes with living in your imagination, because you can identify yourself with what you could have been, what you could do. So you've got what you've done, what you are, and then by positing that underneath, I could have written a great novel. So I'm really an author. It's just I haven't done it yet, but like I could. Yeah. So I can think of myself as an author even if I haven't written anything. Yeah. That's what freedom allows. That's what the idea of freedom does. And he says, and it's just as if this is on page 46 at the end of this section, it's just as if the weakness of the weak, that is to say their essence, their effects, their soul, ineluctable, irremovable reality, were a voluntarily achieved, willed, chosen, a deed, a meritorious act. So believing in freedom, you can kind of, first of all, that you can take your weakness to be something freely chosen. Oh, it's not weakness, I'm meek and humble. Yeah, this is what he thinks a Christian is. Yeah. Oh, I've got this free will. So, when I'm lying down and you're walking on top of me, this is me being humble. Yeah, this type of man needs to believe in a neutral, independent subject, prompted by an instinct for self-preservation and self-affirmation, in which every lie is sanctified. The subject, or to use a more popular expression, the soul, has perhaps been believed in hitherto more firmly than anything else on earth, because it makes possible to the majority of mortals, the weak and oppressed of every kind, the sublime self-deception that interprets weakness as freedom, and their being thus and so as merit. So it's a sort of story we can tell to give meaning and value to our lives. Now, one thing is that so I think ultimately that it's not, the fact that it's false, whether or not it's false, I think for Nietzsche isn't the big deciding factor. Yeah, because remember at the end of the third essay, we have the question of the value of truth, the will to truth. And what he opposes to this is the will to deception, the will of the artist, of the creator. And I think he thinks that the creation of values always involves some deception. It's always a creative act. He thinks we don't discover values, we make values. And the values we make are not true. Yeah. And so I think the fact that he thinks this picture is false really isn't so important. I think really what's doing the work is he thinks it's sort of harmful. And then so one question is do you buy into that? Yeah, do you think it's a plausible story? That and I think today this is there's a bunch of philosophers I mentioned who have stuff. I think Dennett pushes stuff like this. There's this guy, Pierre Boulle, I mentioned him before. He takes a sort of spin. I think here Spinoza's big ally is Spinoza, sorry, Nietzsche. Yeah. So Spinoza also kind of affirms a type of fatalism and actually thinks that the sort of the morality that goes with it is a much healthier morality. Yeah. So I think this bit of Nietzsche is quite Spinocistic. I think he's quite close to Spinoza in this part of his understanding. Okay, so next class we'll carry on talking about Nietzsche, and that I've got a few things I want to say, but I want you guys to come in and tell me your favorite sections. Or I'm going to come into class and I'm going to ask you for some. So next Tuesday, I want you all in coming and yeah, choosing passages, because I get a bit bored of telling you all the time what I like and what I think. Oh, does anyone have a tissue? Anyone? Thank you very much. Oh.